not alone in speaking about structural reforms. I was looking at a speech by Mario Draghi in Sintra in 2015, and in that occasion he actually gave some statistics. And interestingly, since he joined the ECB as ECB president, every introductory statement at the end of a press conference has ended with a call for more structural reforms. 30% of every executive board member of the ECB speech mentions the term structural reforms, and this compares to only 2% of US Fed governors. So clearly the crisis had a role to play in this. And structural reforms, in a way, are not a new topic. Possibly, it dates back as a unified concept. It dates back to the 1990s in a first formulation in John Williamson's book about policy reform and what was then named the Washington Consensus, which is a term that often comes up. And since then, a lot of research has actually been carried out on the topic. I have to say that perhaps less research has been carried out on the topic in Europe or in advanced economy settings. There was a lot of research on Latin America, obviously, because of the experiences of the 80s and 90s. There was research a lot on Asia, Southeast Asia, but less so to an extent in advanced economies, perhaps, of course, aside from the OECD, which has been doing this forever. And a lot of research, in my opinion, was somewhat dismissed during the crisis as we were talking about structural reforms, implementing structural reforms, based on this idea that advanced economies are different. And so that there's only so much you can take from the experiences of other countries or other parts of the world. Since then, it's been 8 to 10 years of the financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis, and I have to say that a lot of research has been going into this topic of structural reforms on Europe, in central banks, at the IMF, at the European Central Bank itself as well, in universities, and today we have here representatives in a way of all these different sides of the research that has been going into all this. We have Anna Fontoura Gouveia of the Banco of Portugal. Anna is a former colleague of mine, actually. We date back to the times when I was at the European Central Bank, and since then she's become basically a structural reform guru in Portugal, and she's your go-to person for structural reforms in Portugal, and she's now at the Bank of Portugal. To my left, we have Paolo Manasse, who's a professor of international economics at University of Bologna. And again, I've known Paolo for a bit, and as a matter of fact, we wrote a book, or I wrote a chapter in his book, to be precise, on the topic of structural reforms, but I'll let him talk about it because I think he will touch upon some of the findings of that book. And last but not least, we have Klaus Masuch from the European Central Bank. Klaus has both theoretical and practical experience on structural reforms, having been a bit the chief from the ECB side of adjustment or troika programs. So he saw how a lot of the structural reform envelopes got carried out in practice. But on top of that, he has recently authored or coordinated efforts of an opus magnum of the ECB on the topic of structural reforms, which should be a go-to reference for anyone that writes or looks into these topics, and I think he will touch upon that. Just a few housekeeping things before I stop talking. I would ask the speakers to be very brief, let's say 10 to 15 minutes, to allow for conversation for Q&A and conversation afterwards. The event is live streamed, and so it's on the record, FYI. And as I said, the Q&A session is at the end, so let the speakers speak. The final thing that I would ask from you all, but I've been reassured while we were outside ahead of the beginning of the lunchtime seminar, is to try and be provocative, let's say, or to really generate some disagreement. I wouldn't want, but I'm sure it will not happen, that people leave the room just knowing that structural reforms are good for growth in the long term. There's a lot that has been researched on these topics. What are the problems? When do they work? Why do they work? What are the channels? What are the packages, sequencing? There's a lot of stuff that can be covered. So try and disagree a bit. And if you don't, I'll make sure to be the one disagreeing at the end. I would go from my right or left to right. So Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alessio. Thank you very much for the extremely kind introduction, actually too kind. And thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure to be with you at this lunchtime. Just an initial statement to say that the views that I'm expressing are my own. I'm not representing any of the institutions that I'm affiliated to. Before actually going into the point of structural reforms, I think it's important for us to take a step back and to actually think, what do we mean by structural reforms? Because as Alessio said in the beginning of in his introductory remarks, indeed, we talk very often about structural reforms, and I'm not sure if we all mean exactly the same thing. Well, when we think about structural reforms, we think about changes in institutions, changes and regulations, and basically we mean to act on the supply side of the economy. And our ultimate goal is to ensure that we are able to foster potential growth. And this goal in itself is basically a normative goal, which is not necessarily the same thing as ensuring shared prosperity. Sometimes we use both as they are basically interchangeably, but they are not. They are two different goals. Sometimes they concur, sometimes not. And I think this is a huge problem because we tend to think that even if the reforms that we have in mind increase inequality, that then these effects would be temporary or that we take care of it somewhere ahead on the road. And the question is, well, do we or can we? What we see is that this issue of inequality, it's an important issue on moral grounds, but it's actually a crucial point if we think about the functioning of our democracies, for instance. And basically, if I look into surveys on EU citizens, on what actually do they have to tell, what we see is that there seems to be a disagreement with current policies. And if we look at top concerns of EU citizens, basically they pinpoint to social issues, to unemployment, for instance. Unemployment is a top concern for EU citizens. And therefore, I'm not sure that when we think about structural reforms that we are actually focusing, or at least that we are putting as much importance to equity considerations as we are putting on efficiency. And probably we should rethink this because equity is a goal in itself. The second point I would like to make is that the idea I have is that we put too much of an emphasis on national action. And I'm not saying with this that national action is not relevant. I think it's absolutely crucial. What I'm saying is that it should go hand in hand with action at EU level. Because what we have is an euro in place, which is actually not working as we expected. There are for sure some flaws that need to be addressed because, well, as it is actually creating divergence. And so the idea that we can go further with risk mitigation and then address risk sharing, in my view, it's a wrong idea. It won't work because we cannot have one without the other. And so that's why I think that at EU level, we need important action. And just to give you two examples, well, I think that we need a stabilization mechanism to actually absorb asymmetric shocks. I think this is absolutely crucial for us to be able to deliver on growth and shared prosperity. even more so because we know that crisis, deep crisis, leave scars. So that there is an hysteresis effect that actually means that cycles then affect the possibilities that countries have to grow in the future. And there are some countries which are more vulnerable to this crisis than others. So not tackling this issue at EU level is compromising all other efforts at national level. Another issue, well, taxation. I think that for sure we have taken some steps in that direction. If we think about the digital economy taxation, we are starting at EU level to take some steps, but something else must be done, not only on that realm, but for instance, in terms of the big elephant in the room, which is tax competition within the EU. There is tax competition within the EU, and that's basically hampering our collective ability to deliver then on shared prosperity. So I could go on forever on what needs to be done at EU level, but I think this cannot be seen as a sequential process that we first implement national policies and then we think about these risk-sharing mechanisms at EU level. This cannot be. Now, getting to action at national level. There, I think we have two big mistakes from the crisis and that we should learn from them. The very first one is the idea that it can be useful to use EU institutions as a scapegoat, that it can be useful to blame it on the EU to then ensure that we have some structural reforms implemented, and that we can just circumvent democratic processes at national level that would eventually lead to a consensus on the policies to take. I think this is very dangerous because it will basically endanger the very EU project itself and the growth that we are trying to achieve. So in my view, this is an absolutely crucial point that we shouldn't use the EU as a scapegoat. And indeed, again, if you look into survey data, you would see that those that are against the EU are also those that are against globalization. There's a link there, and we cannot simply ignore that link. That link is there for a reason. We have losers from the policies. Well, we have losers from globalization. We have losers from other policies that we have been implementing. And if we simply ignore them, we cannot achieve the shared prosperity goal, and we endanger the project, the EU project itself, and the stability of our democracies. And so here the point is that ownership is not a detail. It's something that we need to work on very deeply to be able to achieve the goals that we aim at. And then the second mistake that I think that we have done concerns defining priorities. Simply trying to solve every little problem at national level is impossible. We need to define the big priorities. Well, if you ask me, and again, this is my personal opinion on Portugal, I think the single most important bottleneck that the country faces is education. You know that the share of adults in Portugal that have not completed upper secondary education is above 50%, 50, today. So if you compare to the EU average, so the EU average is half of that, 22, 23%. So right there, you have a huge drag on growth. We have done amazing improvements. So if you think about 2006, this was 70%. So 2 out of 3 adults would not have completed upper secondary education. So I'm sure we are on the right path. But together with a co-author, Ana Fernandes, basically we try to simulate with a general equilibrium model what would be the impact of further reducing that 50% share to 40%. And there you can see that, well, at least using our model, you could have gains of around 7% of your potential GDP in something like 10, 15 years. This is huge. Another study from Francisco Queiro from Harvard, is now at Nova School of Business and Economics. He basically simulated what would happen to aggregate productivity in Portugal if our managers, if the educations of our managers would mimic the distribution of education of the managers in the US. and basically found that aggregate productivity could be increased by 33%. This may seem like a lot, but the issue is that our problems are huge in this realm. So all these gains, I think, are much bigger than what you could achieve by blindly deregulating labor markets, for instance. I'm not saying that we shouldn't look into labor market institutions, and I think we should, also taking into account the recent challenges in terms of the future of work and so on. But I think that there are priority areas that we need to tackle. And then, of course, I mentioned to you educational attainment. There is also the issue about educational quality. And there again, Portugal made huge progress. If you look at PISA results, you would see that indeed the quality of education in Portugal has been improving in all areas, and is one of the countries that improved the most. But if you look closer, what you see is that the high achievers, so the good students, they actually compare very well with their OECD peers. So they actually outperform their OECD peers. The problem is that those students that have repeated at least one grade, they underperform their OECD peers. And that means that our education system is doing something wrong there. And that's a concrete issue that you need to tackle, because it will actually boost both efficiency and equity at the same time. Another priority area, resource allocation. We know that in Portugal we had a huge problem of resource misallocation. We know that, for instance, the non-tradable sector actually absorbed a lot of capital, a lot of financing, a lot of investment, and that needed to be tackled. But I would add that it was not only a problem of inter-sectorial resource misallocation, but also intra-sectorial. So within sectors, we also had problems of resource misallocation. And how can we know that? We can know that if we have access to good data, if we are able to actually look into microdata and to see what type of results can we get from there. And this is what we see for Portugal. So resource misallocation both across sectors and within sectors. Of course, this is a trend which is also common to other OECD countries, but there are specificities for the case of Portugal for sure. We had problems in terms of governance of firms, in terms of governance of banks. We had excessive rents and so on. And this is an area where you see that action at EU level was very important with the banking union that now needs to be finalized. Action at national level was also very important with improvements on the judicial system, with a better insolvency framework and so on. But again, this links with the issue of education, of the quality of managers and so on. So my main point with this is that we need to get priorities right. We have a limited administrative capacity, we have a limited political capital, we have limited resources, we have limited time, and we really need to focus on those areas that matter the most. To be able to do this, we need good data. We really need access to microdata of good quality that allow us to answer some positive questions that we have on the effects of different reforms. I think we have come a long way, and as you said, Alessio, we have more and more evidence on European countries using these very rich micro databases, but more needs to be done. First, on the side of the suppliers of data, the situation in Portugal, for instance, has improved a lot. We have access to firm-level data. We have a very good work-level database, which is now going through some problems in terms of data dissemination. But for instance, on tax authorities, we have no microdata available. And this is a problem because then it means that we cannot really look deeply into the policies that are being implemented. We cannot assess them, and we cannot have a more informed debate, because it's not only a question of getting the data, it's then also ensuring that we have a culture of discussing, of debating, of involving the academia, public bodies, the civil society in discussing these issues and in getting our priorities and our goals, because these are normative issues, our goals right.
Very good. I would have a lot to say, but I'll resist the temptation for later on, if there is time. Paolo.
Okay, so being an academic, I have a presentation, just a kind of, let's see. Okay, thanks a lot. So, yeah, that's me. Let's see. Okay, so I will start with a little bit of advertising, as Alessio was saying before. So a few months ago, a colleague of mine from Athens, Dimitris Katsikas, and myself, we edited this book about economic crisis and structural reform in Southern Europe. And so what I will discuss today is kind of some sort of trying to kind of make sense of this book. And we got a number of chapters. Alessio wrote one about labor, product, banking sector reforms in most of the Southern European countries, particularly Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Cyprus. Italy didn't made it into the list because we had no structural reforms, basically. So it is pity. I was thinking of trying to write a paper or a chapter on Italy, but then I said, what we have? Well, it's really not much. So I will discuss about the conclusion of these books, and let's see. Okay, so the policy lessons. Now, of course, it's not easy to kind of draw conclusions from many different types of reforms done in different countries with different institutions in different economic conditions, with different types of government orientation, competence, with different history of reform. So it's kind of a lot of differences in all these episodes. But still, the attempt is to ask two questions. So the first question is really, what have we learned? And so can we identify some conditions which make reforms more successful, okay? And where are the obstacles and so on. And the other one is more of types of what are the kind of design, what can you say about the design of policy? How should a policymaker, benevolent policymaker, design the policy and implement them to maximize the chances of success? So these were the two questions we kind of tried to give an answer to, okay? And, oops. So, to make a long story short, I mean, we draw a list of at least 6 points which are kind of heavily weighed in these two answers. And let me just go through them. The first is about the delay of the reform. The second is about the ownership. The third is the importance of the external constraint, meaning international financial institutions. Then the timing when you do the reform is important. Then a crucial issue is really the balance between these structural reforms, which are supply side, and Anna was saying before, and the other part of what was going on during the crisis, namely fiscal consolidation. So these two things, it's a kind of problematic relationship. And then the standard, issue of sequencing. This is a long tradition in economics from the 80s, and I think we still have to learn some of the lessons, and maybe we learn a few things more. So these are the crucial things. I will go straight into these. So what we know about the importance of delay is that the longer the reforms are postponed, the worse. I mean, that's the kind of simple point. We know that all the economic crises of all kinds, from default and banking crisis and other type of crises, just happen overnight, but they result from decades of imbalances. So they have a long history, and there are many issues here, and Portugal, Greece, and Italy are example of kind of decades of very low productivity growth and low competitiveness. And we have, kind of, again, Portugal, Greece, Spain, and Italy are a good example of institutions, for example, in the labor market, were very inefficient. In particular, I focus on collective bargaining and the misallocation of resources there, which have been kind of lasting for decades without any attempt of reforms. Then the same for entry barriers, inefficiency in the product market. And then we have, of course, the problems of inefficient supervision, nepotistic corporate governance, and political interference, which are kind of traits of this economy that have been lasting for 20, 30 years. And the point is, of course, the longer these long-term issues are recognized, then the worse it becomes to reform. And not only because it's more costly. I mean, typically, if you have a large budget deficit and you have a lot of debt, then once you have to raise taxes, you have to crash the economy. But also because you have large resistance to reform the longer you have been postponing these reforms. And that's true from a political economy point of view, from a banking sector with non-performing loans, with issues in unemployment and labor market dichotomy, and so on and so forth. So one crucial issue is really delay. It turns out to be very important when the problems are recognized. Let me just move into the second important issue. Now, I don't like the word ownership. Particularly international institutions use these terms, and to me, it's always been just kind of nonsense. But let me use this term just to highlight one point. And the point is this. I think one of the worst implications of this delay is the cultural and perverse illusions that it delivers to the public. So the illusion is that these institutions have been there for ages, for 10, 20, 30 years, and nothing really was wrong. And then all of a crisis, all of a sudden we are in default. So it can't be their fault. I mean, we live with inefficient labor market institutions for so long. So it cannot be their fault. It must be the fault of someone else. Maybe those who try to reform these institutions that are to blame. So this is the kind of cultural and very spread illusions that delay brings with it. And that's, I think, is very, very, very dangerous. And of course, you can translate this into lack of ownership to some extent. And there are a lot of examples. I mean, examples where reforms are backtracked. So you try to do a reform, but then the next government, like in Italy today with the Jobs Act of Renzi, are trying to undo the little that has been done in the recent years. And there are many examples, Greece and Spain for the banking sector reform. Cyprus is also an interesting case where you have a conflict between institutions, on bank recapitalization, for example, that also has to do with this delay and the kind of lack of consensus that, is the other side of ownership. Actually, it's the opposite. There are good cases of ownership, and some of the chapters in this book kind of describe some examples like labor reforms in Portugal and in Spain, for example. And then the difference is that when these reforms were finally introduced, they had a long history. So there was a debate and some previous attempt to reform labor market or the banking sector in Portugal. So there was some sort of awareness, and there was some sort of consensus which was not present, for example, either in Italy or Greece and other countries. So I think this ownership stuff in this sense, I think it's important. Let me move to the issue of external constraints. So what is it a good idea if someone like an international financial institutions try to kind of force the reform into your mouth? As we have seen many examples during the recent crisis. Well, yes and no. This is my answer. Yes, in the sense that it's always good to have, for a politician, to have a scapegoat. You can say, oh, it's all fault of someone else. It used to be the IMF, then it now has become European institutions. But you have to recognize that there are strong limits to what the external constraints can do in terms of enforcement, and in particular in terms of implementation of the reform. So you can start the reform, but then you have to carry it over. And that's where these, maybe the financial constraints is not very effective. And so kind of, I think one thing that comes out from this chapter is that the external constraint is a pure substitute for ownership. Okay, it's an imperfect substitute for ownership, and because in particular there are problems at the implementation level. However, it's better some external constraint than nothing, because when there is no external constraint, that it can even be worse. I mean, in the case of Cyprus, for example, try to kind of manage kind of some loan from Russia, for example, turn out to be a kind of delay in the reform. Now our prime minister is going to China, try to convince them that China should buy a lot of public debt, Italian public debt. I mean, there are ways that all politicians always try to circumvent constraint, and so not having constraint, it can be bad, can be pretty bad. The other thing is that too much of the constraint is even maybe worse. And here, what I'm saying is that what we have seen in many cases in Portugal, for what I understand, if you read the EU report about labor market reform in Portugal, you get to such a kind of level of micromanagement of exactly the kind of tiny measure, how many leave hours, it's just a nightmare. So I think that micromanagement to the level that we observed in Europe, I think in particular from the European Commission, was totally counterproductive. And to me, reading that from outside is totally, crazy. Totally crazy, okay? And we are 6 points, I'm just, number 4, so I hope I more or less managed the time. So here is another kind of issue that has a long story in economic analysis. It is the issue of the timing of reforms. In particular, the question is, are crises good for reforms? So there are a number of papers that claim that, during a crisis, the cost of non-reforming gets so high that government have to kind of implement reforms that turn out to be good for growth. Okay. Now, this is not entirely convincing. At least the example that we observe from the recent experience in Europe are not really convincing on this issue. And in particular, the answer is that if the crisis is already there and it's deep, that's a very bad thing for reform. So it's very costly to implement some structural reforms, as Anna said correctly, are supply-side reforms in a situation of very high unemployment, recession, and crisis. This is because obtaining social consensus on this is almost impossible. So you really hit a political constraint that is something that comes out as the kind of crucial thing into this in this area, which basically tells you cannot do the reform because you will never get enough vote in parliament, because you will never get enough consensus in the society, and so on and so forth. And I mean, Greece, I think, stands out as a good example. I mean, here, the real problem, I think, and the big mistakes of international institutions and countries either that opposed an early debt restructuring is that it really forced such a harsh fiscal consolidation that in the end played in the hands of the anti-reformers. So that was a big mistake, and you cannot really force big structural reform if the country is already in a big recession. Okay. On the other hand, if the country is on the verge of recession, okay, so then the story about crisis being a good thing about for reforms makes more sense, because then you say, hey, we're not going well, and there is kind of dangers ahead, and then it may be better. So don't wait. The lesson of this is don't wait until you're really down into the recession to try to start as soon as you can, at least for a political consensus point of view. Now, number 5, here is the issue of how do you balance fiscal consolidation and structural reforms, okay? And there are different issues here. The first is we know that fiscal consolidation has short-run costs and structural reform has long-run benefits. So it doesn't seem a wonderful idea to start from fiscal consolidation. It should be a better idea if you could, design the things to start from a structural reform, and then when it, you get some of the fruits, then you do the fiscal consolidation. Of course, this is not always possible, always never possible, but still, this issue is important. We have examples. I think Greece is a case in point where we have empirical evidence. I'll show you. Maybe I will not have time, but we have empirical evidence that structural reforms in the labor market were kind of had good effects in terms of lowering price inflation and boosting employment. Okay, but when you do the regression and stuff, it turns out that the effect both on employment and on prices of GDP or unemployment are much stronger. Okay, so if you start, what happened in Greece is that you could have had good effects from the structural reforms on employment and lower prices, but these good effects were really swamped completely by the fiscal consolidation that you had contemporaneously, and so there was you couldn't see any good effects basically, and that was also detrimental for the consensus. Okay, then there is another point. Let me since I wrote this this part, let me kind of spend a little bit of more time about the fact that you never have free lunches. Even in reforms, you don't have free lunches, and there is a clear trade-off in reforms. For example, in the labor market, what we claim in one chapter of the book is that let me just move to the picture here. Is that you have a trade-off between two features of the labor market. Okay, one feature is how resilient is the labor market to a GDP shock. Okay, and this is measured. I will not tell you how. On the horizontal axis by this beta coefficient. This beta coefficient is basically if you have a 1% shock in GDP, how much rise in unemployment do you get? Okay, so the higher is this beta, the more sensitive is the labor market to GDP shock. So high beta is a country where you have, a 1% GDP shocks gets you, I don't know, Lithuania, a 0.5% increase in the unemployment rate. Okay, so that's a feature. Then you have this alpha thing, which is the persistence of unemployment. Okay, so this is basically the first order correlation coefficient. So lag unemployment. So basically a number close to 1 means that the unemployment rate or deviation from equilibrium is very persistent. Okay, so here you see a kind of some sort of trade-off between countries in the Eurozone. So it turns out that countries like Italy, for example, have kind of very small beta, which means very small. They are very resilient. So a GDP shock does not affect unemployment by much. Okay. However, it has a very high alpha. So basically, once you have this shock, it tends to persist a lot. Okay. So you have a whole range of countries. Some countries have, like Spain, for example. Spain is a kind of a country in which you have a strong effect of recession on unemployment, but you have a very fast recovery. Okay. And Italy is the other way around. So it turns out that when you can measure the impact of structural reform in the labor and in the product market on these features of the labor market. And it turns out that structural reform have a good effect and a bad effect. The good effect is that make your unemployment react more rapidly. So you become, you recover more rapidly. Okay, so the market becomes more flexible. So unemployment stay there for a short period. But the bad effect of structural reform is that when you have a shock, it hurts more. So you get a higher rise in unemployment because firms fire like crazy. Now they can't do it, right? So you have to take into account this trade-off when you design a reform program, because if you don't, and you do the reform during the recession, you can get the economy totally messed up, because maybe it can recover more. It will recover more rapidly, but in the meantime, you just create mass unemployment, which is very bad not only for the society but also for the reform. All right? Okay. So let me just close. I may have 2 minutes. Yeah. Okay. 1 minute about the sequencing thing. And so Anna correctly mentioned a political constraint, and let me rephrase maybe what you said, or give me my thing, is that political capital for reformist governments is very limited and should not be dissipated. So I think Danny Roderick wrote extensively about that. And so what you as a policymaker should do, should identify some bottlenecks to growth. Maybe it's education in Portugal, maybe it's inefficient bargaining in Italy, maybe is, I don't know, something which is, you can really identify as the bottleneck, and then you should do that. You should not dissipate your political capital doing everything, every possible reform across the board, because that is not an efficient use of your limited political capital, and the effects on growth may be limited. Okay. Then there is another constraint also that has been referred to before, which is the burden of the adjustment is going to be there, okay, but has to be perceived to be justly distributed. If you don't get that, you are in trouble, okay? And let me finish on that. Okay, thanks.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Paolo. You went over time, but it's okay because you gave a lot of very interesting information. So I resisted the temptation of stopping.
Okay, sorry.
Klaus, I expect you to be Teutonic on time.
No. You just made a mistake because you lost your credibility. You said Paolo could go over time because he was interesting, and as I'm interesting, and as I certainly think that I'm interesting, I will also go over time. No, just to say thank you, Alessio, and thank you, Bruegel, for organizing this wonderful event. Wonderful up to what I have heard. No, very, very good. My presentation is still outstanding. Disclaimer, like Anna said, I'm not speaking for the ECB or for the Governing Council, my personal views. What I'm saying today is largely based on a report we published in June, and this report is a collective effort from task force, from the whole ESCB, from the whole Euro system, and we also had some national central banks from outside the Euro system in the task force, which prepared this report on structural reform. So I'm not claiming that all of this work is mine. There was many very good contributions from many people on this report, but I'm basing my remarks on this report today. And yesterday, I just want to mention, we had a very good discussion in the Commission, where in ECFIN, but several other Director General's business areas were present. And I was very positive. I was very positively surprised about the quality of this discussion about a broad set of structural reforms, institution, political economy. I just want to say that what I'm mentioning here, I'm aware that a number of these issues are discussed in Europe, in the Commission, and are going in the right direction. So it's not that I'm only, making these points to criticize European institutions. Alessio, you mentioned this paragraphs we have at every introductory statement, which Mario Draghi and before Jean-Claude Trichet was reading out about the need for more structural reforms, and that was mainly the reason for the report. And you may ask, why does the central bank do a report about structural policies? And the main reason is that we think socially beneficial structural policies are of great interest also for the central bank, not least because they can support the smooth functioning of EMU, of our monetary union, and they can support the effectiveness and efficiency of monetary policy. So we have a chapter in our report, chapter 3, I think, where we at length discuss the implications of structural policies for the functioning of monetary policy in EMU. So that is, say, the angle which we have. But of course, we are also discussing other issues. A few further messages I would like to share with you. One is that we have a chapter 2 in the report where we say at length, where we show at length how different, and you mentioned this, Paolo, how different countries are in certain features of economic outcomes, employment, unemployment, economic growth, and of input indicators. For example, institutional quality, labor market, product market, institution, and so on. So we simply outline there the differences across EU countries with some other OECD benchmark countries, or benchmark, I would not say other countries, just to show the huge opportunities which every Euro area country, every EU country has to improve welfare, to improve conditions by doing the right structural policies. And of course, then the question is, and I fully agree with Anna and Paolo, to find the right priorities. But there is no limit. There's no scarcity of opportunities. Opportunities are many opportunities for reforms. And two issues which we mentioned here, there are many issues. I have to be very selective. One is the big concerns about youth and long-term, especially youth unemployment, how many people are not in education, training, or in employment. That is still, I would say, shockingly high in many Euro area countries. And that, of course, if 10 years after Lehman and 5 years or 4 years after the last recession, if this is still the case, certainly there are structural reform possibilities there. And second, big gaps in many countries on certain aspects of the quality of institutions. And let me just say, speaking about institutions, let me just say another very important message which we came out in our discussions is that apart from some labor market reforms, apart from some specific reforms, almost all reforms will achieve what Anna said, namely more fairness or more equity and more efficiency. There are many reforms which will, if they are implemented, which will achieve where there's no trade-off, like you have it to some extent, at least in the short term with some labor market reforms, there's no trade-off. You will achieve both, and I give you a list which we have in the report. Of course, and I would say I would support Anna, but to the extent that equity should be pursued by ensuring equal or more equal opportunities, equal chances for everybody. That is the way to ensure equity. To ensure fairness or equity by changing the outcome of a market process, that has limits, and you cannot do everything on that side. So there are different perspectives on how you ensure fairness, and I think the main way to ensure it is giving better opportunities, equal opportunities to children or students from say low-income, middle-income families for university. That's one example. Another example is reduce long-term unemployment with a labor market reform. Of course, this reform may have side effects which should be taken into account. Support integration of labor market prospects of vulnerable people. There are many reforms which will help both efficiency and fairness. And reducing and addressing firms' excessive market power. In many cases, and you mentioned that, we have high rents of firms which can exploit market power and too high profit markups. All the reforms which address these issues will also address fairness or inclusiveness. On the institutional reform side, making public administrations more efficient so they can provide better services to the normal people. That's normally something which helps efficiency and equity, because the people mainly relying on public services are not the richest. Those who are relying on public services are the normal, often the people with vulnerabilities. Fighting tax evasion and corruption is a wonderful area where you can help efficiency of an economy and at the same time help those who have less access to those who are burdened by tax evasion. There's a wonderful study, and you talked about microdata, Anna. There's a wonderful study where I think it's colleagues from Gabriel Zuckman. Zuckman is works together with Piketty, and Gabriel Zuckman has and these people, some Danish or Norwegian experts, academics, do a study using the Panama paper, and they go to Sweden where they have very good microdata, and they can link the Panama paper with the microdata. This is a wonderful study where they have the data, namely in Sweden. It's not that this problem only exists in Sweden, but there they have the data. They go there, link the Panama paper with the statistics, the confidential statistics from the tax administration, and find out that those who evade taxes are the rich of the richest. And that the share of course, if you have a lot of income, you will evade taxes, but in percent of your income, The study comes out with saying that the tax evasion is highest with rich people. And so if you have better tax administration, if you fight corruption, you will not only help efficiency of your economy, you will also go in the equity direction. And that's very important. And we have many problems in Europe there, and Anna mentioned that. And finally, one has to say that rent-seeking behavior generally benefits large firms, influential associations, and well-organized vested interests. And this normally is at the burdens. This burdens normal people. Let me make another remark on the result of our work, namely that there is no, as we would say, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. It is, and this came out a bit of what Anna and Paolo said. It's very important to prioritize those reforms which are necessary and linked to the preferences of the specific say country or region. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach, and that of course makes it difficult. I mean, that of course is the challenge for the European framework. Let me say, and that links to what Anna said. In the current European framework, most structural policies, most institutional policies will be responsibility at the national and the subnational level. That is the situation which we are currently facing, and that means that we also have to be clear that if, and that's what Paolo with the delay of reforms hinted at, if you have suboptimal outcomes, if employment growth, income growth is weak in a country, the responsibility is still predominantly with the policies not implemented or not optimally implemented in this country for possibly many years, or the reforms not being undertaken. And of course we have the problem that those who are responsible for, say, suboptimal policies, they like to blame Europe. Sure. So it's so easy to blame Europe if, or the Euro, or Brussels, or other or European institutions. It's so easy to blame European institutions and thereby distract from the fact that the disappointing economic outcomes or the social problems you have in your country are predominantly caused by current and especially past economic policies not being optimal. And now the question in this respect, a question is what can we do? What can Europe do can Europe do anything in this regard? And I will to kind of reduce this problem of being blamed for something for which it is not, at least not mainly responsible. And I fully agree with Anna. Of course, we need to supplement national reform efforts with a good framework at the European level. Our report was mainly on national reforms because we were talking about structural reforms and institutional reforms in the more narrow sense. We are not talking about EMU deepening. That's a different subject, and there I agree with Anna. Before coming to what Europe could do, quickly, the political economy of reforms was mentioned here, and that's our last chapter in the report, and we devote some discussion on this. And you may think, oh, we have so many opportunities in many, most all EU countries for reforms, and we see so little being done in the last years. We got something done between 11 and 13 mainly. The so-called program countries did quite something in terms of reforms. You are right. Some reforms came too late. Some reforms were not really implemented. Some reforms were unwound later. But all in all, what we have seen in the program countries was good progress on many areas. But later, in the last years, the progress has slowed down, has almost stopped. And we have also not seen many reforms, say very few reforms in Germany after the big reforms, labor market, 10, 12, 14 years ago. No, there was not labor market, pension reforms we had in Germany 14, 15 years ago, 12 years ago, and since then the reform momentum has very much slowed down. Now, you may ask, why is this the case? And there are various answers, but two answers which you find discussed among others in the chapter on political economy. One is very powerful. Vested interests have ability to delay or to hinder reforms, even if they represent only a small minority of the voters or of the population. That's the problem. If the majority of people would feel we would suffer under the reforms and therefore we go against it, that would be fully understood. But we have interests who are so effective that they can stop reforms, even though they are just a small part of the electorate. And the second argument, the second reason is, and you mentioned this, and I fully support that many people lost trust in the ability of the government to implement reforms which are fair, which are helping the majority. And here we come back, and you mentioned, Paolo, this vicious circle. You delay reforms, the government delays reforms, pushes the necessary work to the next government or to the government afterwards. And in this way, the burden on the coming governments becomes bigger and bigger, because not only does the new government after 4 or 8 years inherit very weak economic conditions because growth is not picking up, employment is not as it should be, but also that the people have lost trust in the government. And now the costs for this later government are even bigger to do the reforms. And here let me come to one observation, which is in our report, is we fear that we have still too many abilities for governments, for the current incumbent government, to hide the costs of non-action, to hide the costs of bad policies, of delaying reforms. One example is that in our government, in our budgetary procedures in governments, you know, and also the Maastricht criteria, you know that implicit government debt is not official debt. So whenever there is a chance for the government to or we have implicit government debt for instance, the pension system or others. No, the government promise something to increase pension in the future, but there's no government debt figure going up. So you can do policies where you hide the government debt implications and burden resulting from certain policies. And another example is, and that is of course well known to everybody, is the implicit guarantees or hidden contingent liabilities that are often not subject to parliamentary control or to public scrutiny. And we all know that these played a role in the financial crisis. And what happens? The government, and that's so important for the reform debate, the government can today not set up a proper deposit insurance system. And that's why, and I will tell you why we are for ADIs. So you have no insurance system, but you have implicit guarantees. So the banks, the financial sector, the firms know if something bad happens, we may get some bailout, some subsidy from the public sector. This anticipation means that you have that the guarantees are not only hidden from official debt statistics, but they are also associated with incentives for the private sector, possibly the banks, which go in the wrong direction, which go in the direction of moral hazard, rent-seeking, or overly excessive risk-taking. And that's what we, to some extent, observed then in the financial crisis. As there was no explicit, fully funded deposit insurance system, banks could take too much risks. The cost of these risks would fall on the taxpayer. The taxpayer had no chance to debate it in a normal democratic government process, because this debt was never explicitly put to parliament, because it was implicit. And so you not only had this burden shifting if you have implicit guarantees, you shift effectively wealth from the taxpayer to the bond and shareholders of the firms. But that you don't see in the books of the government, in the debt, you see it in the share prices being higher than otherwise. And so those who are gaining, they know the game. But those who are losing, they have no access, because these things are not discussed. Why am I making so much, describing this issue so much? This is not only in this example. There are many ways where the government can hide the cost of delay because of not doing the proper structural policies from the public. And then the public, as you rightly described, wakes up 4 or 8 years later and doesn't know what happened. So that is where the European institutions come in. That is where the Commission can come in. And like Anna said, more microdata, more analysis being delivered in an impartial way, in an open way to the populations in the countries, because in the end, many of these reforms need to be done at the country level. So in order to be able to do it well, the voter, the citizens need to have the proper information at their hand. And there, I think European institutions could do a lot and are doing a lot, like benchmarking, like comparing different situations across different countries, telling people where institutions are not good compared to other countries, and then letting the normal democratic discussion go, as Anna describes, because you need democratic ownership for these reforms. You cannot kind of impose these reforms from the top. You can only start a discussion like the European semester does very well, I think, and hope that this discussion go to the public sector, to the public in the national rounds, in the national debates, and then lead to a parliament government decision in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klaus, for this overview of your report. This was a lot that is on your plate, and while you guys digest all the information you've received, and probably you have a few questions to ask, I'd have just a few questions, one for each, very quickly, on which I'd like to push you a bit further. To you, Anna, you've stressed the importance of diagnostics and of getting things right at the local level, because every country has its own specificities, which would lead me to say, okay, like different countries have different economic models, with which I think you would agree. But then in a way you referred to OECD rankings, and you told me Portugal is at this or this position on an OECD ranking. Now there are some that would say, like Landpritch at Harvard, that these rankings should be abolished, because what you're doing is that you have a unique model in mind, and that what then people do is they look at the ranking and they say, haha, education has to be a bottleneck because Portugal is not performing well. I'm sure you disagree with that, but I'd like to hear why. To Paolo, you talked about priorities as well, and you spoke about the political economy as well. It feels to me like priorities, there are economic priorities that you described, and that there are political priorities that you described, which rest on a series of realizations, given the majority of in parliament, given the situation, the crisis, and so on. How do you square the two? Do you just look at two sets and you look for the intersection? Is that how you determine the bottlenecks, or what else? And to Klaus, I know you mentioned it, but I know that you have a particular penchant for institutional capacity as a fundamental requirement for policy reforms to take place and to happen in a successful way. And my perception is this is the kind of reforms you should do, or you would want to do in peace times, because they take time to, bring your public administration up to speed. What do you do when you don't have that? What do you do when you arrive in Greece and the public administration is not up to speed, but you are in a crisis and you have to implement reforms? Do you try to go through the timing of it, and so you do first the administrative reform and try to improve the public administration, or you just power through with product market growth enhancing reforms? These were a few points. You can decide whether you want to pick on them or not, but if there are any questions, please, there's a hand over there. We will follow, if you agree, the 3 rules of questions that they have at Kennedy School of Government. The first rule is please identify yourself. The second rule is a question is one question, and the third rule is a question ends with a question mark. Please.
Thank you. My name is Natasha Arvaneti. I'm from the European Committee of the Regions, but this is not the hat I'm wearing right now. being in ECFIN from 2012 until 2014, and a member of the Minister of Finance cabinet in Greece in 2015, I have a lot to say from what I heard here today, but I will not comment on that. I have 3 questions, one for each panelist.
Okay.
The first one is for Mrs. Thirty. I'm not sure I understood the link you mentioned between the EU and globalization. The second one is for Professor Manasse. You mentioned that in implementing reforms, the most important thing is delay. Do you think that there was a micromanagement on behalf of the Troika that hampered the implementation of structural reforms? And my last question is to Herr Mazou, I'm sorry. I remember in your hearing at the European Parliament on the role of the Troika in the first program, you mentioned that some reforms could not go through due to vested interests. So I'm asking you, how do you think structural reforms can penetrate and break up vested interests? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Sorry. Still the European Committee of the Regions, but just one question on a different note. The European Commission has recently put on the table a proposal of something called Reform Support Program, which has 2 legs. One leg is not new, technical assistance, in this specific case provided by the Structural Reform Support Service. And the second leg is the innovation, is a financial contribution that is a lump sum given to a member state willing to engage in a comprehensive and substantial reform package, with the idea that this financial contribution is not to cover direct costs of such reforms, rather it is to provide budgetary relief, with the idea that this would allow the concerned government to, in a sense, buy the political consensus, this is obviously said in my own words, for these reforms. Now the question is, under what conditions is this innovation likely to work?
There's a question over there. Lady.
I'm Bernadette Segol. I'm the former General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation. I have one question and one suggestion. My question is for Mr. Mazou. I don't know if I pronounce your name properly. I'm sorry if I don't. Did I understand you well? Did you say that apart from labor market reforms, all structural reforms would achieve more equality? Because if I understood you well, it means that you acknowledge that labor market reforms are increasing inequalities. And this statement would have very serious consequences. So I just want to be sure that this is what I heard. And my suggestion is, with a smile, there is so much of unanimous support for reform that I wonder if the Economist should not go through a psychoanalysis and check if their support is not just because it is politically correct or for other reasons. I'm really surprised that amongst economists, at least the one I hear, there's nobody saying, well, are we sure?
Question over there.
Thank you. Alexandre Mato for the Spanish media Capital Radio. When doing the reforms, there was the banking reform in the whole continent, and there was a consolidation in the last years. it's true that maybe at some point it was necessary, considering the overcapacity of branches and small entities that were in the continent, but maybe are not going directly or leading to the model of the United States. I'm thinking about Lehman Brothers, these too big to fail entities. So are we not taking a bad lesson from the crisis, or maybe taking a path in that lesson that is not completely right?
Thank you. Final question over there.
Nico Keppens from the Commission, DG DEFCO, Development Cooperation, International Cooperation. The crisis has led to a very negative perception of what the EU and then by extension the Western world is. What is necessary to improve that perception, that the rest of the world again trusts us and also helps us to implement the SDGs, for instance?
SDGs.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Okay, one final question over there, and then you'll take what you want.
Belgium Ministry of Finance, is the lack of data the main problem to implement structural reforms? I'm thinking about tax evasion.
Okay, should we go in reverse order? I'd say pick the questions you want to pick, and you have like 5 minutes each.
Yeah. Just take your time. Yes, on your question, institutional capacity. What can you do if there's a crisis and you have limited capacity of the government? You have possibly issues of rent seeking or cronyism or what. That's a very tough question, because these issues, these institutional issues, strictly speaking, are on the borderline or fall outside what, say, traditionally the IMF was doing for macroeconomic adjustment. Macroeconomic adjustment was mainly, of course, some structural reforms, but mainly fiscal adjustments, some fiscal structural reforms in order to ensure that you have sustainable fiscal policies, and then you can do some other reforms. But these deeper institutional reforms, for this, it is difficult to, in a time frame of a normal program of 2 or 3 years, it is difficult to convincingly change all of these, to bring institutions which are relatively weak up to the best standards. So that takes time, and but you have to work in that direction, but you cannot hope that you have to start working, but you cannot hope to achieve everything in a few years. This is something which takes time. I think Natasha Panetti, was it your name? On the vested interest is a bit the same question. It is in the end the main. If you have vested interest in your countries, and you have this everywhere, I'm not saying that this is a particular problem in one or another country, it's mainly up to the society in this country to address it and to be aware of it. Of course, it's problematic, as we have also alluded to in our report, if these vested interests have strong influence on media and thereby on the thinking or the information which is provided to the citizens and the voters. There's one issue where Europe could possibly have a beneficial impact on the qualities of institutions, and that, of course, also on the power of vested interests, because vested interests often have power if things are not fully transparent, if accountability of politicians is not clearly defined, and then they can do something in favor of some vested interests instead of in favor of the majority of the society. So what possibly one could do? We have a remark or a paragraph in our report saying that considerations could be given to linking the funds, future EU transfers and funds, to improvements in the quality of national and regional institutions that are relevant for the successful implementation and use of these funds. So I'm not saying that Europe may link, say we are giving structural funds to build a bridge or a road or a railway, and to say this we link to a labor market reform. I would not say that this is good. I would say you can of course link it to a reform in the areas which are responsible and which are important that these structural funds, in this case infrastructure, are efficiently used, not used for cronyism or corruption, but really efficiently used. There the EU, the Commission, has a strong argument. We want that this is taxpayer money from European taxpayers, that this is efficiently used. So if you want to have it, we need full control. You need to have the best standards in procurement. We want e-procurement. We want full transparency about all negotiations of the contracts which are used to build the bridge and so on. If you have this transparency, you have more accountability, and the risks that the funds are misused are reduced. And in this way, you can address the vested interests. In this case, say from the construction sector, which everywhere has quite strong vested interests, because then there's more transparency and the risk that some funds are not efficiently used is reduced. That's why Europe could do something, but I would not think that Europe could do everything. It's mainly the responsibility of the of the societies, of the civil society, of the electorate to do that. Perhaps if a final remark to the colleague from ETUC, you said, you were at ETUC. I have not said that labor market reforms increase inequality, but there is the following issue, that of course if a labor market reforms that is aimed at reducing unemployment and will reduce unemployment, such a reform may boost labor supply, which at the same time may, ceteris paribus, reduce the real wage of those who have a job. So you have some conflict. Those who are unemployed may be happy because after some time they get a job. Those who have a job, due to the increase in labor supply, ceteris paribus, may see their income lower than otherwise. So you have some redistribution between certain groups of workers and unemployed, which may not be the best from those who have a job. Therefore, you need to complement such reforms in a package with other reforms. And in our report, we have a nice study from the German reforms in the early 2000s, labor market reforms, fiscal reforms, and there they show in this study that the labor market reforms alone would have reduced somewhat the income of a certain group, namely, in this is a model of these people who are liquidity constrained, so people who are not very rich, who have not financial capital, cannot easily get a credit from the bank. But if you combined the German labor market reform with the fiscal reform, which reduced taxes on labor, that then helped to overcome this problem. So you have to go into very detail. You cannot bluntly say labor market reforms are bad. You have to get them into a package where those who may see their real wages relatively lower due to the reform for some time, that they get compensated via, say, lower taxes on labor, for example. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with Alessio's question about priorities, political and economic. It's a difficult question. Maybe my answer could be that kind of the way I look at this issue is really what is the constraint, and the constraint is really the political constraint. So maybe kind of the approach is, you get the government to sit around the table and say, we have a set of proposals for reforming this and this, and which one will get 50% of the vote or support, say, in Parliament, okay? And then you have, we cut down the number of reforms to those who will make it in Parliament, and then we rank them in terms of efficiency and say which is the most important for growth. And then you say, subject to the political constraint, let's put our capital in this, and the one that will be education or whatever. So that would be the way, just maximizing with a constraint, it would be the same logic, although, it's a bit abstract. Then I had the second question from a lady there about what I meant by delay and micromanagement. So by delay, I mean simply the fact that it's very difficult for the public in general to kind of attribute, correctly identify the causes of a crisis, like in Greece. I mean, Greece had grown for 15 years before the crisis, of course, just incurring in debt and consumption, and without any gains in productivity. So things seems to be wonderful. I mean, Greece had done pretty well, and all of a sudden, all these gains in 10 years, were dissipated in a few years. So it's very hard from someone from Greece to say, well, what are the causes of that, and to say, well, it's your institutions which you did not reform, because you start to blame something that did not happen. It's hard to see. We had this kind of Sherlock Holmes. I don't know, it was the Baskerville hound dog or one of those things. So the issue there was that the hound, the dog, did not bark. And that meant that he had recognized the killer. But so the solution was to find something that didn't happen, and that would give you the solution. So it's very hard to do this. And so the more the reform are delayed, the harder it becomes to identify the reason for that and to blame the wrong people. So those who want to change the things, maybe it's too late. So that is what I meant. About micromanagement, I think for what I read, there was an issue there in Greece as well. And my kind of suggestion, or orientation would be to set kind of broad lines for reforms and then leave some space for the government to exert its kind of will, popular mandate, at least within these constraints, and surely this is not, for what I can say, was not done. Then there was a question about, I thought interesting, are you economists so sure about the structural reform, after all the disaster we have seen, And I would say that Kurt gave some example of the fact that it's always better to have a larger pie and then think about how to divide it than just be happy with a smaller pie, and then maybe if it becomes smaller, you can argue even more. So I think the philosophy to some extent is to try to see if there are reforms that are good for growth. And at the same time, so that was the missing part, just to try to ensure an equal division of the pie, rather than say, oh no, it's there are costs of having a higher pie. Let's just be happy with the, how do you say, degrowth, negative growth, I don't know, happy degrowth, whatever. So I think this is shared by economists, whether you may agree or not. But in terms of welfare, it's better to have higher consumption than lower consumption. So that's the theoretical statement that most of the economists would agree. I personally subscribe to that, but maybe you say, there are things that are not marketable, and everybody's happy, love in children, and so on and so forth, which I also agree that you cannot measure with GDP. Fine, but still, I would subscribe to the general thing. So I think that's the thing. And then the final answer to, I'll pick another question is about the banking reforms. Are we not going toward the kind of American model? And then presumably you have in mind some sort of agglomeration taking place in most banking sector. There is the risk, I think. There is a concrete risk of that we are going too far in trying to copy the American model, which had a lot of problems. But these are, I think, problems with supervision, basically. And the question is, can we get the benefits of efficiency and not be kind of trapped into the supervision problem? And when I look at Italy, for example, we had some recent reforms, and this very small regional banks were really a source of corruption, credit given to the friends, misallocation result, and all the small bank failures that we had in Italy were really, had a serious problem of political interference and so on and so forth. So in that, having larger banks, I think may be relatively good, provided that there is an independent supervision that makes sure that we don't go to the kind of extremes and unregulated or not sufficiently regulated model of the US. I will stop here, and also there are other questions, interesting questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions. Starting with yours, Alessio. My point is that I mentioned one OECD ranking, PISA scores, and not others which are very popular, like the Employment Protection Legislation Indicator, the Product Market Regulation Indicator, and that was not by chance. Because indeed, I think that some of these indicators, by just simply trying to boil down everything to a single number, are an oversimplification and cannot really capture all the dimensions of product markets or of labor markets in our countries. Still, maybe more than the rankings, I think that OECD has a wealth of analytical work which can actually be very informative at national level, and we should really start from that, because the type of horizontal assessments that OECD does with a very rigorous econometric approach with very high quality data is very informative for then the national assessment that we also need to do. So I see it more or less as complements. I'm not a fan of those rankings. I think that some are still better than others, but indeed they can be oversimplifications. And also the important thing is how can we use them then in our assessments? Just to use a single figure and to try to find out correlations between those ranking indicators and GDP growth, for instance, I think that's meaningless. There's nothing you can extract from that. If you really want to know more about structural reforms, you have to go into the detail of specific reforms in a specific economic context and then make your assessment with the use of national data. Then, on your question, on this link that I was making between EU and globalization, basically my point was that if we look into survey data, so into opinion of EU citizens, what we see is that there's a link between those that state that they are against the EU and that are against globalization. So this sentiment is usually something that you see at the same time. And what I meant with that is that the basic fear that is under these two sentiments is the same. It's because basically these people feel that they are losing something and they see it as basically two sides of the same coin. That was my point there. Then on the question on the reform support program from the Commission, I truly believe that we have a lot to learn from each other. So that countries in the EU, we have many differences, but we also have many similarities. And well, in many things we operate under the same framework. And so I think that we can learn from each other. We can learn from the diversity that we have in the EU. So the idea of countries looking at other country experiences and getting something out of that, I think that's indeed a very important point. Then, on the financial contribution to reward reforms, or the way you put it, to make reforms easier, there I have some concerns if this comes with some conditionality attached, and I think this links a bit to what Klaus mentioned in his intervention, which is if that means that then you are imposing certain reforms, certain specific reforms, irrespective of national consensus, irrespective of national economic structures, then I don't think this is a good idea. Still, overall, my impression is that there are those countries that benefit more from the euro than others, and with that we need to do something. So if we are talking about funds, structural funds, financial contributions that actually address those asymmetric benefits that were created, then I'm in favor. If they are linked to specific policies, which in the end are, in my view, normative issues, then I take an issue with that. Finally, on the point on are we sure that we have a consensus on reforms? that's why precisely I started my intervention with trying to figure out what exactly do we mean when we say structural reforms. Because, well, it's very difficult not to agree with the idea that we want to improve our institutions. If it's something as broad as that, well, yes, if there's scope to improve our institutions, we want to use it, we want to take advantage of that. But then I'm not so sure if I agree with Paolo on the issue that increasing the size of the pie is always a good idea, and then we aim at redistributing it in the best way possible. I really think that, well, reality or the evidence that we have is that sometimes what you see is an increase in inequality, which in the end is not addressed. There's a promise that we'll then later on handle it, but we never do. And this creates tensions, which then are, the way I see it, probably irreversible in terms of our democratic processes. And so the lack of data, is it the main problem? Well, the lack of data is one solution. No, we need data to be able to say, to give more than opinions on the outcome of the different reforms. But in the end, it's a choice of our societies to decide to go one way or the other. Microdata can help us to have a more informed debate, to have a more concrete idea on the different impacts of the different reforms, and then it's a political decision to decide on the way forward.
Thanks a lot, Anna. I have to say, if there is one common element that I heard in all your presentations and I was very happy about, is this idea that there is country specificity, that every country is different, and therefore the packages cannot be standardized. Now, I'm always afraid when we mention every country is different, because the nihilistic consequence of that statement could be there's very little we have to learn from experiences, because every setting is different, every moment is different. But I have to say, at least from my side, I learned quite a bit in terms of general lessons that were appropriately targeted at a general level, but not too wide, at least from my point of view. So I had two missions today: to learn something about structural reforms and make them disagree. And Anna was disagreeing with Paolo at the end, so I feel my mission is achieved. Thanks a lot for coming and staying a bit longer today.